He's the guy who opens doors, remembers anniversaries, and would rather die than raise his voice at a woman. The man who was raised to treat women with respect, to communicate calmly, to solve problems through discussion rather than domination. The gentle giant who prides himself on never being that guy who loses his temper. But watch him 6 months into a relationship with the wrong woman, and you'll witness a transformation that would make Jekyll and Hyde look like a minor personality adjustment. The patient man becomes the angry man, the gentle communicator becomes the frustrated yeller, the respectful partner becomes the resentful aggressor. And here's the part that will make you question everything you think you know about relationship dynamics. She created him, not intentionally, not maliciously, but through a psychological conditioning process so subtle and so effective that neither of them realizes it's happening until it's too late. Today, I'm going to expose the hidden mechanism by which women accidentally train the most patient men to become the angry men they claim to hate. Because understanding this process isn't just about saving relationships, it's about preventing good men from becoming the monsters they never wanted to be. Every relationship is a behavioral laboratory where actions are constantly being reinforced or extinguished. The woman becomes the scientist, though she doesn't realize she's conducting experiments. The man becomes the test subject, though he doesn't understand what's being tested. And the results of these unconscious experiments determine whether love grows or dies, whether respect flourishes or withers, whether patience persists or transforms into rage. Here's how the experiment typically begins. The patient man notices something that bothers him. Maybe she's always late. Maybe she dismisses his opinions in public. Maybe she makes financial decisions without consulting him. Maybe she flirts with other men in ways that make him uncomfortable. Being the respectful communicator he is, he brings it up gently. "Hey, I noticed that when we were at dinner last night you interrupted me several times when I was talking. It made me feel like my thoughts weren't important to you." Her response? Nothing. Or worse than nothing. Deflection, minimization, counter-accusation. "You're being too sensitive. That's not what happened. You're trying to control me." The patient man's calm, respectful communication bounces off her like water off a duck's back. So he tries again. Different approach, same respect. Maybe he waits for a better moment. Maybe he frames it differently. Maybe he focuses on his feelings rather than her actions. The result remains the same, ignored, dismissed, invalidated. This is where the conditioning begins. She has just taught him that respectful communication gets no results. Calm discussion produces no change. Patient requests fall on deaf ears. She has inadvertently programmed him to understand that his preferred communication style, the one he was taught to use, the one that reflects his values, is worthless in this relationship. What happens next follows a predictable psychological pattern that plays out in relationships worldwide. The patient man, having learned that respectful communication fails, begins unconsciously searching for a communication style that will work. His brain starts running what I call the escalation algorithm, a desperate search for the volume, tone, and intensity that will finally make her listen. He tries being more direct. Still nothing. He tries being more serious. Still ignored. He tries being more persistent. Still dismissed. Each failed attempt teaches him that he needs to escalate further to break through her wall of indifference. This process can take weeks, months, sometimes years. The patient man doesn't want to become angry. He fights against it, resists it, tries every alternative he can imagine. He'll attempt to be funnier, thinking humor might work. He'll try being more romantic, hoping affection will open her ears. He'll experiment with timing, with location, with different approaches and different words. But she has unknowingly designed a system where only one type of communication gets through: escalated communication, loud communication, angry communication, the kind that makes her pay attention because it threatens the peace she's been taking for granted. The moment he finally raises his voice, not because he wants to, but because he's exhausted every other option, something magical happens. She listens, she responds, she acknowledges the issue. She might even apologize or promise to change. In that moment, she's completed his behavioral conditioning. She's taught him that anger works where patience failed, that aggression succeeds where respect stumbled, that the communication style he despises in other men is the only communication style that works in this relationship. The tragedy of this dynamic is that patient men are often the ones who fall hardest into this trap. Impatient men, aggressive men, naturally dominant men. They escalate quickly and establish their communication patterns early. They can afford to be lazy hunters because prey is abundant, but patient men invest months or years trying to make respectful communication work before they reluctantly adopt the angry approach that finally gets results. This creates a psychological crisis for the patient man. He finds himself becoming someone he doesn't recognize, someone he doesn't respect, someone he swore he'd never become. He starts questioning his own sanity. Am I the problem? Am I actually an angry person who is just pretending to be patient? How did I become the kind of man who yells at women? The answer is simple. He was trained, conditioned, programmed by a woman who responded to nothing else. He didn't choose to become angry. He was systematically taught that anger was the only language she understood. But here's where the psychology gets truly insidious. Once this pattern is established, it becomes self-reinforcing. She starts responding to his anger not because she suddenly respects him, but because she fears the disruption of conflict. He continues using anger not because he enjoys it, but because it's the only tool in his relationship toolkit that produces results. Both of them begin to hate the dynamic, but neither understands how to escape it. She sees him as an angry man who yells to get his way. He sees her as someone who forces him to yell because she won't listen to anything else. They're both right, and they're both trapped in a system that serves neither of them. When a patient man realizes he's being systematically ignored unless he escalates to anger, he reaches a psychological crossroads with 3 possible paths. Each path leads to a different version of himself, and the choice he makes will determine not just the fate of this relationship, but the trajectory of his character development for years to come. Path 1 is the escalation highway. This is where most men end up, almost by default. Having discovered that anger gets results, they begin incorporating it more regularly into their communication style. What started as desperate last resort becomes standard operating procedure. They transform from patient men who occasionally get angry into angry men who occasionally show patience. This path creates what I call anger addiction. Not because men enjoy being angry, but because they become dependent on anger as their primary tool for being heard, respected, and taken seriously. They lose faith in their ability to influence their environment through calm discussion and become reliant on emotional volatility to create change. The psychological cost is enormous. These men lose respect for themselves as they watch themselves become the kind of men they used to judge. They develop internal shame about their communication style but feel trapped by its effectiveness. They know they're not being their best selves, but they also know it's the only version of themselves that gets results in this relationship. Path 2 is the internal collapse. Some patient men, horrified by their own capacity for anger, choose to shut down entirely rather than become someone they despise. They stop communicating their needs, stop setting boundaries, stop expecting their concerns to be addressed. They become ghosts in their own relationships, physically present but emotionally absent. This path creates what psychologists call learned helplessness. These men convince themselves that their needs don't matter, that their opinions aren't valid, that their role in the relationship is to accept whatever behavior their partner dishes out. They become shells of their former selves, trading their voice for peace, their needs for harmony, their self-respect for her approval. The tragedy of this path is that it doesn't actually solve the problem, it just moves it underground. The issues that needed to be addressed don't disappear, they fester. The resentment doesn't vanish, it accumulates. These men often become passive-aggressive, indirect, and emotionally unavailable as they try to protect themselves from further disappointment. Path 3 is the strategic exit. This is the path chosen by patient men who recognize the conditioning process and refuse to participate in it. They understand that a woman who only responds to anger is a woman who will systematically erode their character over time. Rather than become someone they don't respect or disappear into themselves, they choose to leave. This path requires the highest level of self-awareness and self-preservation instinct. These men recognize that some relationship dynamics are inherently toxic regardless of the individuals involved. They understand that staying in a relationship that requires them to be worse versions of themselves is a form of self-destruction that no amount of love can justify. Understanding how this conditioning process works requires examining the specific mechanisms by which patient men are trained to abandon their natural communication style. It's not a conscious conspiracy by women to create angry men, but rather an unconscious pattern of behavioral reinforcement that produces predictable results, the process begins with what I call selective response syndrome. The woman in question doesn't intentionally ignore calm communication and respond to angry communication. She simply finds calm requests easier to dismiss and angry outbursts harder to ignore. Calm communication feels optional. Angry communication feels urgent. When he says, "I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know when you're running late," her brain processes this as a suggestion that can be considered later or forgotten entirely. When he says, "I'm tired of you being late all the time without any consideration for my schedule," her brain processes this as a crisis that requires immediate attention. This difference in processing creates the reinforcement schedule that shapes his behaviour. Psychologists have long understood that intermittent reinforcement, sometimes getting results, sometimes not, is the most powerful conditioning tool available. But what's happening here is even more insidious. It's differential reinforcement based on emotional intensity. The patient man learns that his calm requests have a near zero success rate, while his angry outbursts have a much higher success rate. His brain, designed by evolution to repeat behaviours that produce desired outcomes, begins shifting his default communication style toward the approach that works. This process is accelerated by what I call the urgency illusion. When he finally gets angry and she finally responds, both of them interpret her response as evidence that the issue was finally serious enough to warrant attention. They don't realise that the issue was always serious. What changed wasn't the importance of the problem, but the volume at which it was presented. The most devastating aspect of this dynamic is how it systematically erodes the respect foundation that healthy relationships require. When a woman only responds to a man's concerns when he expresses them angrily, she inadvertently communicates that his calm, respectful communication isn't worthy of her attention. This creates what I call a respect recession in the relationship economy. The patient man begins to feel that his thoughts, feelings and concerns only matter when he packages them in anger. His respectful approach to communication, the approach that represents his values, his character, his best self, becomes worthless currency in the relationship marketplace. Meanwhile, the woman begins to see him as increasingly aggressive and unreasonable, not understanding that she has trained him to communicate this way. She doesn't connect her pattern of ignoring his calm requests with his pattern of escalating to get heard. In her mind, she's dealing with a man who has become inexplicably angry and difficult. This creates a feedback loop of mutual disrespect. He loses respect for her because she forces him to yell to be heard. She loses respect for him because he yells to be heard. Neither understands their role in creating the dynamic that's destroying their connection. The respect recession spreads beyond just communication patterns. He begins to question whether she actually values him as a partner, since she clearly doesn't value his preferred way of expressing himself. She begins to question his character, since he clearly has anger management issues that make her uncomfortable. Patient men face a particularly cruel psychological trap in relationships where only angry communication works. Society has spent decades teaching men that anger is toxic masculinity, that raising their voice is abuse, that any form of aggressive communication is unacceptable in relationships with women. Simultaneously, they find themselves in relationships with women who have unconsciously designed systems where anger is the only effective communication tool. They're damned if they get angry, society labels them toxic, and damned if they don't. Their concerns get ignored indefinitely. This double bind creates intense psychological pressure. The patient man knows that escalating to anger violates everything he's been taught about healthy masculinity. But he also knows that staying calm means accepting that his needs will never be met, his boundaries will never be respected, and his voice will never be heard. The cruelest irony is that the women creating these dynamics often consider themselves advocates for healthy masculinity. They genuinely believe they want men who communicate calmly and respectfully. They just don't realise they've created relationship environments where calm, respectful communication is systematically punished through indifference. The root of this conditioning process lies in how different communication styles compete for attention in the modern relationship economy. Women today are bombarded with information, requests, opinions, and demands on their mental bandwidth. In this environment, calm communication gets lost in the noise while emotional intensity cuts through the clutter. When a patient man makes a respectful request, It joins the queue of hundreds of other inputs competing for her mental processing power. His calm tone signals that the issue isn't urgent, so her brain naturally prioritizes more pressing concerns. The respectful delivery suggests the matter can be addressed later, so it gets filed away and often forgotten. But when he finally escalates to anger, everything changes. Angry communication bypasses the normal filtering system and demands immediate attention. Her brain processes it as a potential threat to relationship stability, triggering fight-or-flight responses that force her to focus on the issue right now. This isn't conscious manipulation, it's evolutionary psychology at work. Human brains are wired to pay attention to emotional intensity because intensity historically signaled danger or urgency. In the modern relationship context, this ancient programming accidentally teaches patient men that emotional intensity is the only way to break through their partner's attention barriers. The most tragic victims of this dynamic are often the most patient men, the ones who try the longest to make respectful communication work before resorting to anger. Their patience becomes their greatest weakness because it allows the conditioning process to run its full course. An impatient man might escalate quickly, establishing early in the relationship that he expects to be heard when he speaks. This creates clear boundaries and expectations that prevent the slow erosion of respect that patient men experience. But the patient man gives her hundreds of opportunities to respond to calm communication before he finally tries anger. By the time he discovers that anger works, the pattern has become deeply ingrained. She's had months or years to practice ignoring his respectful requests, making it her default response to his non-angry communication. This patience paradox means that the men most committed to healthy communication patterns are the ones most likely to have those patterns systematically destroyed. Their virtue becomes their vulnerability, and their commitment to respectful dialogue becomes the rope by which they hang their own character development. When patient men finally do escalate to anger and get results, they often misinterpret what's happening. They think they've finally gotten through to her, finally made her understand how important the issue is to them. In reality, they've simply triggered her emergency response system. Her brain doesn't process his anger as evidence that the issue matters more than she realized. It processes his anger as evidence that relationship stability is under threat and requires immediate damage control. She responds not because she suddenly respects his concern, but because she wants to restore equilibrium as quickly as possible. This misunderstanding perpetuates the cycle. He believes his anger helped her understand his perspective, when actually his anger simply activated her conflict avoidance reflexes. She believes his anger was an unreasonable overreaction to a minor issue, when actually his anger was the predictable result of having minor issues ignored until they became major frustrations. Neither understands the true dynamic at play. She has accidentally trained him to use her emergency response system as his primary method of relationship communication. He thinks he's finally being heard. She thinks he's become unreasonably aggressive. Both are wrong about what's actually happening. The most insidious aspect of this conditioning is how it gradually erodes the patient man's core character traits. He doesn't wake up one day and decide to become an angry person. Instead, he experiences a slow-motion character assassination that happens one dismissed request at a time. Month 1. He tries calm communication. It fails, but he maintains faith in the process. She was probably just distracted. Month 3. He's tried multiple approaches, none have worked, but he still believes respectful communication is the right path. Maybe I need to find better timing. Month 6. He's exhausted his repertoire of respectful approaches and is beginning to doubt his own communication skills. Maybe I'm not explaining myself clearly enough. Month 9. He's starting to feel resentment building but still refuses to escalate. I'm not going to become one of those guys who yells at women. Month 12. He finally snaps, yells, and gets immediate results. The conditioning is complete. By the time he realizes what's happened, the damage to his self-concept is significant. He no longer sees himself as someone whose calm communication is effective. He no longer trusts his ability to influence his environment through respectful dialogue. He has learned to see anger as his most reliable tool for creating change. This character erosion extends beyond the relationship. Men who learn that anger works in romantic contexts often begin applying the same principles in professional, family, and social situations. The patient man becomes the angry man across all areas of his life. Understanding this dynamic creates an opportunity for prevention that serves both men and women. Women who recognize their pattern of ignoring respectful communication can consciously train themselves to respond to patient requests before they escalate. Men who understand the conditioning process can establish boundaries earlier to prevent the pattern from developing. For women, prevention requires recognizing that dismissing calm communication creates the very aggressive communication they claim to dislike. When a patient man makes a respectful request, treating it with the same urgency as an angry demand prevents him from learning that anger is necessary for attention. This doesn't mean agreeing with every request, but it does mean acknowledging every request promptly and clearly. I understand you'd like me to text you when I'm running late. I don't think that's necessary, but I hear that it's important to you. Let's discuss it. This response prevents the conditioning cycle from beginning. For men, prevention requires establishing clear communication expectations early in relationships and enforcing them consistently. I prefer to discuss issues calmly and respectfully. If this approach doesn't work for resolving problems between us, then we're probably not compatible long term. This boundary setting prevents the slow erosion of respect that turns patient men into angry men. It also identifies women who are capable of responding to respectful communication before significant emotional investment occurs. Every patient man eventually faces the ultimate choice. Will you become someone you don't respect to maintain a relationship with someone who won't respect your preferred communication style? Or will you choose to remain someone you respect, even if it means losing relationships with people who can't appreciate that version of you? This choice reveals character at the deepest level. Men who choose to preserve their values demonstrate long-term thinking and self-respect. Men who choose to abandon their values for relationship success demonstrate short-term thinking and external validation dependency. Neither choice is inherently right or wrong, but each choice creates a different trajectory for personal development. The man who becomes angry to maintain relationships teaches himself that his core values are negotiable under pressure. The man who maintains his values despite relationship costs teaches himself that his character is non-negotiable, regardless of consequences. The tragedy is that patient men are forced to make this choice at all. In healthy relationship dynamics, respectful communication is not only accepted but preferred. The need to choose between character and connection reveals a fundamental dysfunction that serves neither party's long-term interests. Understanding how women accidentally turn patient men into angry men isn't about assigning blame. It's about recognizing patterns that destroy relationships and characters simultaneously. When we understand the conditioning process, we can choose to participate in it or interrupt it. For patient men, your calm communication style is not weakness to be abandoned when it doesn't immediately work. It's a strength to be preserved by choosing partners who appreciate it. Don't let anyone train you to become someone you don't respect. For women, when a patient man makes a respectful request, treat it as seriously as you would treat an angry demand. Don't accidentally condition good men to abandon the very communication style you claim to prefer. The goal isn't to eliminate all anger from relationships, it's to ensure that anger remains a rare expression of genuine urgency, rather than a learned tool for basic communication. When patient men are forced to become angry men just to be heard, everyone loses. If this analysis of relationship communication dynamics has opened your eyes to patterns you've experienced or witnessed, subscribe to this channel for more insights into the psychology that governs human connection. Hit that notification bell because understanding these dynamics could save your relationships and preserve your character. Share this with anyone who needs to understand that respect shouldn't require volume, and patience shouldn't be punished with indifference. The patient man's dilemma isn't just personal, it's cultural. We're creating a society where the men most committed to healthy communication are systematically trained to abandon it. Understanding this pattern is the first step toward changing it.